So we are continuing with our Part 3 lecture on Baroque music. This is Chapter 2, which is Music in Baroque Society. So I already mentioned that the common people, if they wanted to hear professional musicians, they had to go to church. Professional musicians tended to work either at the courts of the wealthy or in church. Obviously, you weren't getting invited to the court of King Louis XIV to hear the violins of the king, which was an ensemble that he had. So, you went to church if you want to hear professional music making. However, one thing that everybody wanted was new music. It's kind of funny to think about this today because we think about classical music as being a museum society where all we listen to is old music. And today, that is very much the case, where 90 to 95% of the repertoire that you will hear in an orchestra concert was written somewhere between 20 and 300 years before the concert. But in those days, everyone wanted new music. Hey, we've heard your third concerto, where's your fourth concerto? The variety was necessary. We've already talked about, in the courts, they showed off their wealth by how many musicians and how famous of musicians they can hire, and some members of the nobility were musicians. King Frederick of Prussia was actually a flute player that Bach wrote some music for him. Church music was very complex. Churches would have an organist, of course. They would also have a choir. They would have an orchestra. Depending on the size of the church, that orchestra might be between 10 and 20 musicians, and they were salaried. They were on staff, although they didn't make as much money as you could make working for the nobility. But the advantage to that was that the nobility, if they could fire you whenever they wanted to, because let's say a more famous composer became available, then they could run out and hire that person because it's all about showing off. And as a worker, you didn't really have any real rights. The church, they didn't tend to fire you. They didn't tend to move on to the next big name. So there was more stability working for the church, even if it didn't pay quite as much. The larger cities employed town musicians, which was a third option, although not as desirable of an option as working for the nobility or the church. And we'll talk about this when we talk about opera in the Baroque period. But there were some public opera houses, initially in Italy. The first one opened in 1637. And when these public opera houses opened, they hired musicians as well. So these are places where you could work. The ultimate goal was to be a music director. You could be a violin player who played in the orchestra, but the ultimate goal of a trained musician was to be a music director because it was the most prestigious and highest paid position you could have with the most creativity. What did a music director do? And the duties were very similar, whether you were a music director at a church or at a court for the nobility. First and foremost, you composed music. You had to write music. Remember, they wanted new music, so you were always cranking out new music. And it was written to order. The church would tell you, we need this kind of music, and you would have to write that kind of music. Your boss, the king, the queen, the duke, the earl, whatever, would tell you, I want you to write this kind of music, and you wrote that kind of music. You also performed, usually at the keyboard instrument, and you organized the performances. You were in charge of organizing and staging all of the performances that happened in that church or at that court. And that can be a lot of performances, especially in the courts of the nobility. You're responsible for hiring the musicians. Let's say that a violin player leaves for whatever reason or is fired, then you're responsible for finding and hiring the replacement musician. Training, especially in the churches, you're responsible for training the musicians, especially because the churches, women were not allowed to sing in church. They used boy sopranos. Many times these boy sopranos were in orphanages that the church sponsored. The church supported. Orphanages and churches were linked together, so you were responsible for training these boys to sing in your choir. You're responsible for taking care of the instruments because many times, especially with your harpsichord and your organ, the more expensive instruments, they were not owned by the musicians. They were owned by either the court or by the church, and you were responsible for making sure those were kept in good upkeep. So, why do it? As I said, it's the most prestigious position you could have. It paid the best of any musician's positions. Other benefits, like you got to write music and have it performed by people, which, believe me, if you're a composer, There's no guarantee anyone is ever going to play your music, but if you're in one of these positions, you're absolutely guaranteed they're going to play your music. But you were still considered to be a servant. You did not have freedom to just quit and leave. You had to wear a uniform. You had to sign a contract. You were not allowed to speak to, if you worked for a duke, you were not, in many cases, allowed to speak to the duke unless first spoken to. You were most assuredly not allowed to eat at the head table with the duke unless invited to. So you were a skilled servant on par with the butler or the head chef or the blacksmith. But that was life in the Baroque era to some degree. You know, you were either one of the 1/10 of 1% or you weren't. So how did you get your training? Most people were born into it. Most people came from families of musicians. For example, Johann Sebastian Bach's brother and father were both musicians. Sometimes, if you showed ability, you might study through apprenticeship, where your family would sign you on with a master musician, and that person in the apprentice system, that person, the term was usually somewhere around 7 years, if I remember correctly. For 7 years, you would study and train with that person in exchange for basically being that person's servant and assistant. Or, as I mentioned before, if you were an orphan, if you were in an orphanage, they would train you up in music. Eventually, you'd be a boy soprano in their choir, in the church's choir, and then if you learned enough, then you would eventually move on to become a professional musician. It was a trade that they would potentially teach the young men, again, young men, so that they would have something they could go out into the world and do professionally. Okay, now we're going to get into some specific forms of music, and these will come with specific musical examples. So first, we're going to talk about, these are things that were invented during the Baroque period. First, the concerto grosso. The concerto grosso is orchestra music that came out of the Baroque period that basically pits a larger group of musicians, who is the accompaniment, against a smaller group of soloists. The small group of soloists are called the ripieno, and the orchestra is called the tutti. Tutti is Italian for all. Usually, a concerto grosso is in 3 movements. A movement is a section of a larger work that sounds complete by itself, but it's just one section of a larger piece. You can think of movements as being like chapters in a book, for example. They have, you almost always have a cadence at the end, and then there'll be a pause, usually when the musicians turn their pages, and then they start on with the next movement. So a concerto grosso is usually in 3 movements. The first one is fast. The second movement is a contrast. It'll be slow and quieter, and it might be in maybe a minor key. And then the third movement is also fast, but it's in a dance-like rhythm, usually some kind of a triple meter. Concerto grosso is all about contrasts. It's all about contrasting the small group of soloists against the large group of orchestra. So it utilizes terrace dynamics, usually, softer when the small group's playing and then louder when everybody's playing. The form that this music is in a lot of times is called ritornello form, which essentially means every part of the music alternates with the refrain, or we would call it the chorus in a pop song. So the first thing you hear in a concerto grosso is the ritornello. We'll call it A. You remember when we write on the board and we kind of chart out form. The first major melody you hear is called A. That's your ritornello. And then we'll have B, a contrast to that, usually played by the group of soloists. And then A comes back. Usually not the whole thing, though. Usually just a fragment of A. And then something new. We'll call it C. And then A comes back again, another fragment of the ritornello. And we just keep alternating back and forth between the ritornello and other chunks of music until we get to the end of the movement, when we usually play the complete ritornello again. And then that's the end of the movement. So this is where you will listen to, I will post a YouTube link to one of Bach's Brandenburg Concerti. The book uses Brandenburg Concerto number 5 as its example, but I'm actually going to use Brandenburg Concerto number 2, I believe, the first movement. It's for orchestra, and the solo group in Brandenburg Concerto number 2 is a flute. It's actually a recorder, not a transverse flute, a sideways flute, what we think of as being a flute, but a recorder, an oboe, a violin, and a trumpet. that's your ripieno, that's your solo group, and they are surrounded by the tutti. So at this point, listen to Bach Brandenburg Concerto number 2, which I will link in Blackboard, and pay particular attention to the alternating between the soloists and the large ensemble, the contrast in texture, the terce dynamics when they're playing loud and then they play soft, also the repeating rhythmic patterns and the complicated melodies that just kind of go on and on and on. Also pay attention to the way the chord structure just kind of progresses along. It's got a very steady pulse that is marked down by the basso continuo, the harpsichord, and the cello. So at this point, you listen to the first movement of Bach's Second Brandenburg Concerto. Okay, so you've listened to Bach's Brandenburg Concerto. So now we're going to move on with another genre, another new development in the Baroque period. It kind of takes some musical ideas that have been happening before with imitative polyphony and raises them to a higher art form. This is called the fugue. A fugue is polyphonic, meaning it's got many voices in competition with each other. It's imitative polyphonic, meaning it's got one main melody which then imitates in a different voice, and this is how they create the polyphony. This main melody, main theme, in a fugue is called the subject. In a fugue, you almost always hear the subject by itself first. Some composers have written very complex fugues where the subject is not by itself first, but in most cases you're going to hear the subject by itself first. It's then imitated in every other voice. When I say every other voice, most of these fugues are written for keyboard instruments. So what the composer does is they kind of look at the keyboard and they think, okay, from this note up, that's my soprano. I'm just going to write everything on the top line of this fugue is going to utilize this range. And then the next block of notes down, I'm calling my alto and then my tenor. And on an organ, the bass is played by the foot pedals, the low notes. This actually makes fugues very easy and obvious to transcribe from the keyboard instruments they were written for and rewrite them for string quartets and brass groups and woodwind groups. Fugues, Baroque fugues, especially Bach fugues, have been pretty much rewritten for almost every kind of instrumental combination that there is because they're so clearly set up in soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. People have even said words to them and sung Bach's fugues. So the main theme of the fugue is called the subject. After the first appearance of the subject, it then comes back in, the subject appears in another voice, and that is called the answer. And when the second statement of the subject is happening, the first voice almost always goes on to a counter subject, which is a second theme which accompanies the subject all the time, except the first time you hear the subject when it's unaccompanied. So a fugue is basically subject, 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 happening all these voices accompanied by the counter subject, except sometimes it's not. Sometimes the composer writes all new music where the voices that are playing are all playing something that is not the subject. This is called an episode. I think of an episode as being a palate cleanser. If you've ever eaten in a fancy restaurant or gone to a wine tasting or something like that, after you eat something, they give you something that is going to clear your palate, clear all the flavors out of your mouth, so that the next thing you eat or next thing you drink, you can taste without mingling the flavors. An episode is kind of a palate cleanser, where it gets the subject out of your ear, so that the next time the subject comes in, you'll clearly hear the subject being stated. And that's what an episode essentially does. Another fugue term is called a pedal point. A pedal point is essentially a long sustained note, usually in the bass, which is why it's called a pedal point, because you're holding down a pedal, but a pedal point can actually be in any voice. It's not uncommon to hear them in the top voice, and sometimes that pedal point is a trill, meaning a rapid alternating of two notes back and forth from each other. The whole point of a pedal point is to create tension, is to create a fixed point so that all the harmonies are clashing with this fixed note, eventually leading to some kind of a resolution. So the example of the fugue that we're going to listen to is Johann Sebastian Bach's Fugue in G minor, which has been nicknamed the Little Fugue, because Bach actually wrote two fugues in G minor. One of them is long, and this is the short one, which is why it's been nicknamed the Little Fugue. He didn't nickname it that, other people have. The fugue structure looks just like this on this particular slide. This is slide number 21, where we start with the subject and the soprano, and then the subject comes in the alto, while the soprano goes on to the counter subject. Then the subject comes in the tenor, while the alto goes on to the counter subject, and the soprano goes on to some new material we haven't heard yet. Then the bass comes in with the subject, tenor, counter subject, soprano, sustained note, only a trill, a pedal point, and then we have an episode where none of the voices are playing the subject, clearing the ear for the next entrance of the subject in the tenor. That is the opening structure. There's this great video on YouTube. It's a graphic score, meaning it's not written music, it's actually a video that shows you exactly how this fugue works. I'm going to link to that, and I'd like you to watch that now. Pay particular attention to all the different voices entering in with the subject, and then listen for episodes. You can tell an episode because you're not hearing the subject at all, and then when the subject comes back in, it should be somewhat notable. I think I may actually link an assignment to this as well. I'll just have a couple questions about this particular fugue performance that I would like you to answer and submit for homework. So at this point, listen to the example of the Bach fugue in G minor and answer the questions that I pose. Okay, so now we're moving on to another genre of Baroque music, and this is called opera. Opera is considered to be one of the most important inventions in musical history. Many people think opera is the highest art form that there is because it combines all other art forms. Think about it. In opera, you have vocal music and you also have instrumental music because you've got an orchestra that is sometimes accompanying the singers and sometimes playing by itself. You've got poetry in literature because before you can set it to music, it all has to be written out. It's essentially a play that is written and then set to music. You've got acting, because the singers are not only singing, they're acting. You've got dancing. A lot of operas involve dancing, sometimes very simple dance scenes, sometimes incredibly complex, elaborate dance scenes. You have visual arts in scenery. They have to create the scenery and the backdrops and all the props, and costumes. They also have to create costumes. And if you've seen different productions of an opera, the director of an opera, producer and director of an opera, make the same kind of decisions that the producer and director of a movie make. Yes, you can have the opera look exactly like it would have looked in the year that it was written, or you can try to update it to a contemporary version of that same opera. The music's the same, the words the same, but the costuming and the setting might be radically different. I've seen settings of operas that take place in all sorts of interesting and, quite honestly, very odd places. Now, we talked about the musical. Opera, in some ways, is similar to a musical, but there's differences. For example, in serious opera, there's no speaking, there's no dialogue. Everything is sung. There is also comic opera. Now, in some comic opera traditions, there is spoken dialogue. Other comic opera, however, later comic opera especially, eliminate spoken dialogue and use the same conventions of serious opera. The music expresses the mood of the opera, of course, but also can help you identify characters, can identify action, help move the plot forward. And as we move forward through time, when we talk about opera a couple hundred years after its invention, it gets really complex, and characters even get their own theme music. Performers, they have to be able to sing, of course, but you also have to be able to act. Act appropriately, act in whatever ways the director tells you to act, and you have to be able to sing. And most opera houses have no amplification, so you have to be able to sing and fill an entire theater with your sound at the same time that you are acting. Sometimes, maybe you've just been stabbed and you are dying on stage and singing about it. It's not easy. The different roles of people you'll see on stage, you of course have your principals, the soloists. Those are your main characters and your supporting characters. They of course have all the solo songs. Then you've got your chorus. The chorus is the group of people on stage. They'll sing. They always sing together, and they kind of earn a supportive role in crowd scenes and group scenes, things like that. Then you have dancers. Some people who work in opera houses don't sing at all. They're only on stage for the complex dance numbers that some operas have. And then extras, which are actually called supernumeraries, which literally means extra numbers. And they fill out crowd scenes, but they don't actually sing, they don't dance. They're just put in costume, and they're supposed to act in an appropriate way, just like extras in a movie. So, opera words. The libretto, which literally translates as little book from Italian, is the text of the opera. You think the libretto is kind of like the play that they write before they set it to music. Who writes the libretto? Well, the librettist writes the libretto. So once the librettist writes the libretto, the composer sets that to music. Now sometimes the librettist and the composer are the same person. Some composers chose to write their own librettos before setting it to music. Other people collaborated. Mozart, for example, in the classical era, probably his greatest operas were collaborations with a librettist named de Hont, who's just terrific librettist, and he and Mozart, when they worked together, they created works of absolute genius. Originally, opera was for fancy people. Their first opera was actually written to be performed at the wedding of the King of France to Maria de' Medici. The Medici family was the most powerful and wealthy family in Italy. So basically, you had the King of France marrying the daughter of the most powerful Italian family. So the first acknowledged opera that was written in 1600 was written as an entertainment to entertain the rich people at their wedding during the days of festivities going on. Today, well, you can see an opera anytime you want. You can go on YouTube. There are many dozens, probably hundreds, of complete opera performances on YouTube. You can buy them on DVD. They used to broadcast them on TV, not infrequently, although I haven't seen one recently. Of course, it's all about the action on the stage. But you have your live musicians, you have your orchestra accompanying the musicians. They're out of sight. Most theaters have a pit. Actually, if you go into the EH Theater here at Dell State, if you look in front of the stage, you'll see a big half circle of wood that's painted black. That actually used to be a pit, which is a sunken area, an area that is below floor level where the musicians would stay. I don't know why they filled it in, quite honestly. I'll have to ask the theater manager if he knows why they filled it in, but it's no longer a usable pit. They filled it in, they covered it over. But that's where the musicians are, and then the conductor stands at the front of the pit, facing the stage, facing the orchestra and the stage. That way, the orchestra can see the conductor, the people on stage can see the conductor, the audience can see the back of the conductor, maybe just their head, and they're conducting. The first thing you hear in most operas is called an overture. It's an instrumental prelude that the orchestra plays before the curtain even comes up, and that usually contains a lot of music, melodies that you're going to hear later in the opera. Operas are divided into acts, just like musicals and plays are divided into acts, and acts are divided into scenes. Acts are notable because there's always an intermission between an act. So you have Act 1, we start. Within Act 1 you will have scenes, Scene 1, Scene 2, Scene 3, however many scenes. During those scenes, there are sometimes set changes, lighting changes, but the action doesn't actually stop. The music keeps going. At the end of the act, we have sometimes a cliffhanger, sometimes we have a complete cadence, the lights go up, everyone goes out into the lobby and goes to the refreshment stands where instead of buying beer and peanuts, they probably buy wine and cheese and things like that, depending on which opera house you're in, of course. And then you go back in for Act 2. Musicals are almost always in 2 acts. Operas vary. Many operas are in 3 acts, some are in 2 acts. There are some 1-act operas that are only an hour and 20 minutes long, straight through with no intermission. So your singers, your principal singers, are singing all the solos. And there are 2 kinds of solos that they're going to sing. There's the recitative. A recitative tends to be very simple. There are a lot of words in it. The music is set syllabically, meaning every syllable of a word gets its own note. And they also don't tend to change pitch widely. That's because in a recitative you're delivering a lot of information. The recitative was replaced by spoken dialogue in the musicals, where in an opera they would be singing this delivery of information. In a musical, they speak it. And then the aria expresses emotion. They're almost always paired together, where in the recitative, the soloist presents the problem. And then in the aria, they emote about the problem. Also, you have duets, self-explanatory, two people singing together, trios, quartets. Anytime you have more than three people singing at a time, that's generically referred to as an ensemble, where we have, now this is important, we're talking about duet as two soloists, trio is three soloists, quartet is four soloists. I've seen opera scenes that have as many as 8 soloists singing and interacting at one time. But each line of music is being sung by one person. As soon as a line of music is being sung by multiple people, that's called a chorus. And the chorus is usually made up with a large crowd on stage. It can be many things. It could be a big party scene. It can be a scene at the end of one of the German operas where everyone's standing around waiting for a call to arms by a guy that actually turns out to be a bad guy named Hundig. Like the Greek chorus from drama and tragedies thousands of years ago, the chorus sometimes provides commentary on what is happening on stage. They also, of course, provide backdrop, and they're an important part of the action. And professional opera companies have fully professional choruses that you have to audition to get into the chorus, and they're salaried positions. Most popular operas are in Italian, German, or French, because opera was very, very popular in continental Europe. It was invented in Italy, so for the first 100, 150 years, all serious opera was in Italian. It was thought to be the language of opera, was Italian. Eventually, composers in other countries started to write in their own languages, especially in the 1800s. People began to write in France. They began to write a lot of operas in French, and in Germany, of course, they were in German. In England, even back in the late 1600s, Henry Purcell wrote a great English opera called Dido and Aeneas. But opera wasn't as popular in England, and the people that were writing opera in England were still writing in Italian. And in America didn't really have much in the way of original opera until the 20th century. So the vast majority of operas in the standard repertoire, that is, that most opera companies perform, are in Italian, German, and French. So how do you know what's going on? Well, the vast majority of opera companies use super titles. That is, a screen above the stage where they project the translation of the words. Certain opera companies, the Metropolitan Opera in New York, which is the largest, most active and wealthiest opera company in North America, every seat has its own little display in the back of the seat in front of it, just like in an airplane now. And you can not only decide if you want to have the translation on or off, but you can also set the translation to whatever language you want, because the Met is still a big tourist attraction. So you sit down in your seat, you can decide if you want your translations in English or Spanish or Korean or whatever. So opera was originally composed for court ceremonies. It was originally composed, as I said, for the wealthy, to be performed in the very largest courts. It was a huge display of wealth because you could not stage an opera. It called for so many musicians, singers, and instrumentalists, and sets, stages, costumes. You could only stage an opera if you were very, very wealthy. All of the early operas were based on Greek and Roman myths, which was also somewhat calculated. The people that invented Baroque opera were trying to revive the tradition of Greek drama. That's where that came from. But it also gave the patrons, the composers, and the people attending a great opportunity to try and curry favor with the rich people by drawing parallels between the Greek and Roman heroes on stage with the king, the queen, the duke, or whoever. However, opera proved to be a big draw. And if you think about it, I always use the analogy of, what if movies were so expensive to produce that only the super rich could afford to see movies? And maybe Bill Gates and the DuPont family and Bloomberg and all these people had private movie theaters in their houses, in their estates, But the only people that were allowed to watch these movies were them and the friends of the very wealthy. Eventually, everyone would want to see movies. Some smart person would think, all right, I'm going to take the money and I'm going to build a public movie theater. And I'm going to show these movies, and it's going to cost money up front, but it's going to be popular, and then any person can come in and pay me money to see a movie. Same thing happened with opera. For the first 40 or so years of opera, it was only available to the wealthy. But then in 1637, in Venice, Italy, someone built a public opera house, and it was incredibly popular. So popular that by the end of the 1600s, there were several dozen public opera houses. It became a huge tourist attraction. People would travel from all over Europe to go to Venice to see opera. They had incredible special effects for the day, the kind of effects that no one had ever seen before, by building stage machinery to create certain lighting and smoke and other kinds of effects that no one had ever seen before. This kind of money being generated in opera actually led to virtuoso singers. A virtuoso is someone who shows incredible ability at something, usually applied to music, sometimes applied to mathematics. And no one was more highly paid or more famous than the castrati. A castrato is a boy soprano who is castrated, literally castrated. They have their testicles surgically removed before they enter puberty. Because of this, they grow up to be an adult male, but they still have a soprano voice. Their voice never changes. So they combine the lung power of a man with the soprano voice of a boy soprano. They became very popular, and many leading roles in the 1600s and 1700s were written for castrati. Eventually, they went out of style. And so today, of course, there are no castrati singing in operas. But it was very common for a couple hundred years. Frequently, people selected to be a castrati were either orphans or the children of poor parents who thought, okay, if I do this and my son grows up to be a famous singer, then we will be pulled out of poverty. Didn't always happen that way. Sometimes someone would be castrated and they would grow up and they wouldn't have the kind of adult voice that they had as a boy soprano, the quality, and they wouldn't become famous. And then that just kind of really awful for them. So at this point, we'll go ahead and end part 2 of the second part of the part 3 lecture. We will continue with the third and final part of the part 3 lecture.